Thanks for having me. And having me again. It's really, really thoughtful. I'm really excited. And just for all the listeners out there who might not know what Monograph is, I'm Robert, CEO and co-founder. We're one of three co-founders who started Monograph. Monograph is a time tracking project management tool designed specifically for architects by architects. Really focus on solving practice operational problems and workflows for the architectural community and our customer base, of really trying to surface financial information in the most creative, representational way back to architects.
That's a beautiful summary. So what's kind of interesting is that I do recall from the first time we had you on the show is that you guys have a very particular perspective and philosophy about what you do and why it's important. And it is about time tracking and these kinds of things. But what's also fascinating about your approach and all the other content you guys produce, like the tutorials and the interviews, it's really, the heart of it is actually about best practice and kind of the bigger scope, right?
Correct. We also believe that it's really, really hard to get to best practices if you don't track time. At the end of the day, we're all architects here, and fundamentally we're a service-driven profession. So the best way to understand how well we're doing as individuals, as designers, as architects, as practitioners, is we need to understand what our baseline is. That baseline starts with understanding how we spend our time.
Gotcha. So what are some of the things that's happened in the last year since we've had you on? I mean, do you guys have some new features going on? Like, how is the business of Monograph, or even the platform of Monograph, the application of Monograph, changed in the last year? Because I have a feeling you guys are always hungry and trying to evolve and grow. And I actually remember the last time we spoke, you had this like mental list of all the things you wanted to achieve, and we're like, yeah, that's going to take 50 years to do.
How are we doing on that list?
How are we doing on the list?
We're moving the needle one step at a time. If I recall, the last time I shared a little bit of our larger vision for where I foresee the business going, and it's really to be a system of record for all things built. So if we really start to unpack what is a system of record for all things built, it is going to take many decades for us to fulfill. And we fundamentally believe if we want to tackle that problem, we have to start where projects start, and they start in architecture. The fascinating part is, to be a system of record for all things built, we don't end in architecture. We follow the entire process from start to finish, and we're going to try to solve every single problem along the way. And if we think of it that way, there's a lot of problems within the practice of architecture, and it's going to take us a while before we can figure out solutions and design optimized workflows for every single part of that puzzle.
I'm curious, do you only have the people who use your software? Is it mostly really strictly architects and designers, or do you also have the consultants or the contractors or people who are directly related to architects also using it?
So our customer base primarily is architects, but we do have a number of landscape architects, consultants, and essentially, if you think of it, they're mostly essentially consultants on the architecture and engineering side. Most of our problems that we solve today are with problems that are within the SD, DD, and CD phases. By the time we get into CA phases, most of those problems start to persist, or at least start on the GC side. And we haven't evolved yet to start solving those problems, but we will.
Gotcha.
It's a big scope.
That's a big scope.
It just keeps us extraordinarily motivated, and we know that the time horizon is really long.
Yeah.
We could narrow it in and really identify what are the things we have to do now in the next, let's say, couple months, couple quarters, couple years, to essentially continue to move the needle. Been really excited over the last year. The entire company grew from 8 last year when we started, and we're 50 now.
What?
Whoa.
Probably another episode. I can spend an entire episode of what's it like to grow a company from 8 to 50 in a course of 12 months. I have a ton of war stories, a ton of things that I've learned, a ton of things that went well, and a ton of things that didn't go so well. But it was an incredible year of deep learning and really hyper growth in the last 12 months.
So what happened? What happened to make you grow the company from 8 to 50? I mean, that's a big growth.
That is a big growth. So a lot of things converge. I think at the peak of the pandemic, we saw a lot of demand from architects that are really looking for solutions as they start to try to navigate and solve problems. And how do you operate a practice under the new norm?
Because of
Essentially,
COVID.
because of COVID.
Yeah.
Because now you have, even if you were all localized into the same city or one office, you were still essentially running a hybrid model where a big portion of your team might be working remotely now. And there's a whole bunch of new firms that are popping up that are exclusively remote first. How do you start to essentially handle practice, and how do you start to handle operational workflows that are now completely out of the office? So we saw a big pull last year from our customers, and that drove the first half of why we grew so much. The second half is we were able to secure our Series B round, which was another injection of $20 million around this time last year. And that continued to fuel our growth into this year.
Wow.
It's fascinating because on the business side of things, you guys all have heavy architecture backgrounds, which is what makes Monograph different from other similar companies that architects might use for time tracking. But of course, like the actual business of Monograph, you're not an architecture office, so it's like funded differently. It seems to be quite different in many different ways, in many ways. But have you found, you yourself as a firm owner, but in a different space, that some of those war stories, as you described, have helped you guys think about how Monograph should evolve for this other industry, which is architecture, if that makes sense? Like, are there parallels between the two?
So yes and no. I think at a very high level, how architects think about money and how architects think about business, we can learn a lot from the venture world. But I think at a high level only. I think by the time you're getting to execution, it's very different. The business models are very, very different, and there's not a lot of crossover in terms of similarities in how a professional services studio model can relate to a venture-backed software technology company.
Right, like a product-based
correct
business.
Yeah,
gotcha. And is one of the big differences because for architecture offices, I guess it's maybe even more important to keep track of hours, because it's almost like the service or the product is the amount of hours you put into something in a way.
So I always get asked is like, well, what happens if you don't track time, or why do you track time, or why is time related? How does it influence your billings? I like to keep things really, really simple. Regardless if you're going to use your hours to bill or not, you should just understand how well you are doing as an individual and as a team. And the only way you really, really know how to do that is to understand how much time went into it. By default, as architects, I have 100% faith in all my friends and myself. We know what work we need to do. Mm-hmm. The tasks and the deliverables and the milestones and the percent complete phases are very clear to us. Most of the time, what's not clear is, well, how much time did I actually put into it, really? And if you extrapolate how much am I worth, is that number a sustainable number?
I feel like a lot of people might be doing okay in tracking their time. I'm not sure how well, like, and I also speak for myself, I'm not sure how well I would be able to interpret it and understand that data, seeing like, okay, what I understand, I spend more time here and more time there, but what does that mean in terms of business necessarily?
And that's exactly why Monograph is so important, because our job always is to make that association really, really simple. Right? Ideally, you can see something on Monograph and know exactly, okay, so all this data that I just entered into the software, this is what it means. I am easily, when you look at a chart, I'm on track, off track, or behind.
Gotcha. And I think that's an interesting topic in the larger sense of taking raw information, or in this case, raw data, and in this case, we're talking about hours and money, and if you're ahead or behind, and then that being tracked, but then also being not interpretive, but translated and displayed or communicated in a specific way where it's effective. And I think that's also very parallel to what architects do and in a very broad sense of gathering a bunch of different information. In the case of an architecture project, it's information about the site, the budget, the client, the program, everything, and then trying to synthesize that and then communicate it in a way where it means something and it's saying something and it can be easily understood and read by the receiver. And I feel like that's also, again, in a broad sense, one of the specific things that you guys have really zeroed in on with Monograph is that's the key thing, is how do you translate this information to make it useful?
Absolutely. Like I'm going to borrow some of your vocabulary here. And like, if you think of an architect's job as to synthesize spatial data and make it extraordinarily easy and representative in the next version of a design option for your clientele, our job is to synthesize financial data. So that's extraordinarily easy for an architect to consume and understand the state of the business and the state of each project.
So I guess one question that people might be wondering is, first of all, Monograph, is it suitable for a certain size of office? Like, do you typically say, like, you should use our program if you're up to this side or a minimum of that size?
We're really focused on small firms.
Gotcha.
So as small firms as a solo practitioner, and our largest customer is around 90.
Okay.
But our averages hover between 5 and 10.
Okay.
And that's because past 90, you start getting into much more complex time tracking and hierarchy, or?
Well, our software is going to continue to evolve, and we'll continue to make it better first and more suitable for larger firms. But at a certain scale, most architecture firms have multiple studios. Mm-hmm. So you're dealing with multiple time zones. If you deal with a large enough studio, you might be dealing with multiple currencies, like a Chicago office, an LA office, Paris office, and a Hong Kong office. Your financial data becomes a lot more complicated because you're also trying to essentially do the currency conversion ratio.
Right. I see.
Either back into US dollars or back to wherever HQ is, headquarters. Mm-hmm. So there's a much more complex model when you start to scale beyond 100-person firm that we haven't yet started to solve yet.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
I think it's also true that for the reasons you mentioned, it makes sense to from your perspective, to start and focus on the small firms, but also, and as you know this, there are a lot of small architecture offices, a ton of them. And with the way architecture is, a medium-sized office or a large-sized office, when you translate to other businesses, they would say, well, that's still dinky, tiny. What are you talking about? But anyways, to say that there are many, many small offices, certainly in the United States.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, that's where my passion and my heart is. Because I feel like the larger firms, though very large, they have access to tools.
Right.
The tools might not be very modern, not be very good. Needless to say, they still have tools. At the very small scale, where I spent the bulk of my career, the understanding is like there is not really a lot of tools. There's not a lot of systems. There's not a lot of prescribed workflows. Mm-hmm. It's really the part of the industry that needs the most help. And it fills my cup of joy every day to make sure that we focus here and we really help move the industry forward by working on problems where it matters the most.
That gets to another larger topic of I think what's cool about you guys and even you just as an individual is that you think about the company, the Monograph, and your guys' product, but you also think about the profession of architecture and just the profession of architecture and how it's health, And obviously that's something that we talk about a lot on the show. And I like the idea that, there's a lot of offices that are that size, and that's kind of part of your passion is in that space, because what you're saying is right. Like when you are a large office of 100 people or more, hopefully at that point you have the resources, you have cash in the bank, you have the ability to go and acquire tools, you have the time and the staff to do these things. And I say hopefully because at that size you need them.
You gotta have your things together.
But it's totally true that when you're a small office, whether it be one person or 10 or 15 people, the kind of power packs and the assets and the tools that you're describing, sometimes they feel like as a small business owner, that they're out of reach or that they're not accessible because I don't know, because they're too expensive, because they're not meant for me, or I haven't heard about them, or whatever else, you know. And I always feel like in this industry, architects at the smaller size offices are always trying to like reinvent how they're inventing their business from scratch. And sometimes I think, you know, that you shouldn't have to do that. Like someone must have solved this problem before.
100% agree. Like why should you when the objective is to do good architecture?
Right.
The objective is to focus on design. The back of house practice ops workflow should have been figured out decades ago by someone else. The fact that there is no tools essentially is the drive for me every day, every morning I wake up. And we can talk about like too, like that the larger firms, yes, they do have the resources, but I have strong opinions that those resources are misaligned. The tools they have were designed originally in the early 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
The way they've designed software for that segment of the market was primarily designed for accountants and bookkeepers first, which is also why they're extraordinarily chunky software and they're hideous for architects to look at because they didn't design it for architects first. I think that's what at the end of the day makes Monograph really special to me, and what I think is really special to our customer base is that we always design software for architects first. And yes, we have to touch on the financials, and yes, we have to like translate hours, dollars, invoices, like the accounts, receivables. But our stakeholders in the way we've designed our product is architects first.
So one of the other questions that came up when you were talking about, you know, small offices using your guys' products, and maybe there's an office now who barely does any time tracking at all. And I guess one question listeners or folks like that might have is, well, why can't I just open up an Excel sheet and just punch in hours and make tabs and columns and whatnot? Why not just do that? You know, isn't that enough data for me to see to know how my office is doing?
Yes and no, right? I think the beauty of entering data, as we talked a little bit earlier, is the ability to translate that data. Data for data itself, and if you don't have the ability to translate it to really give you indicators of like how well you're doing, then it's kind of useless data. And if it's in an Excel spreadsheet, the first thing I would question is how accurate is that data? Do we really like spending our times in Excel spreadsheets? Most of the time, the answer is no, and the likelihood of that being accurate data is fairly, very off. It's part of the reason why I'm solving this problem now is because back in the day, I used to always lie on my Excel spreadsheets. I didn't want to be in there. I want to get in, I want to get out. There was no incentive for me to essentially log accurate information. I was young and naive, and I didn't realize that eventually leadership was going to make decisions off of that data, hopefully. There are firms where you don't make decisions off of data. That's a different topic. But let's say a firm does, but they're making decisions off of data that's 100% off.
I think it's another good point of if you put in the information yourself and you look at yourself, that's like one level of understanding the story of what's happening of this hypothetical office. But then the next level is if you have a handful of employees, or if you're just one person, you have 5 different projects over the course of 6 months or whatever, how are you going to, in a concise way, look at the summary of all of that if it's in an Excel sheet? Maybe if you're out there, you're some Excel wizard. I know Excel is actually quite powerful, but I think as you said, like there's a very high chance that there's maybe 0.0001% of the architect's population who's an Excel wizard and is going to achieve what I'm describing. But you know, it actually can very quickly become very complex. It's not just a matter of, I punch in numbers for a month and I'm good for one project. No, you have at any given time, even as a small office, like 10 different projects going on in different phases. And if you have employees, I mean, that gets very complicated.
And different people and different methods of billing and different contracts and everything just ties together, right? So.
It can get really confusing really, really, really fast. And I think what's important for all of us to understand is we're not accountants. We're not bankers. We're not financial analysts. we don't see the world through numbers. We're trained as architects and designers. We see the world visually. We understand things visually. And it's really, really important to understand and see the financial health of your business or projects visually, because that's how we're trained, and that's our job, and that's how we see the world in front of us. This is also what makes, I think, one of the very first features we launched when we started Monograph is what we call the money gap, which is literally a gauge of like how much time you've logged to date, relative to where the project is to date. So like ideally, if you're 50% through a project, you should have consumed 50% of your fee through your timesheet. And if you're not, then you should be questioning, am I spending too much time or too little time? Because you want to make sure you stay on pace.
Yeah.
I have two different analogies. Sorry, David. No. I was just like, if you're a marathon runner, you want to make sure you don't run too fast, because you're gonna tired and you're not gonna finish. So running at the right pace is more important than just tracking, where you are.
Gotcha.
You have to understand the pace. The other analogy is, well, you and I are both in San Francisco. We might make trips to Tahoe. So I compare a money gap to literally your gas gauge in your car.
Yeah, right.
Like you just need to know how much gas you are. If you hit Sacramento, which is about halfway there, do you still have half a tank left?
Right.
And if you don't, you might have to stop and fill up for gas. But like just the fact of knowing is so powerful, because it tells you exactly where you are relative to where you're going.
Actually, that's a pretty good analogy, because you would not drive any long distance without paying any attention to the fuel, because you'd be screwed.
So the fuel gauge itself is our money gap, and just tracking the fuel is kind of like logging your time.
Gotcha. I wonder if that's a good point. If it's accessible to just quickly show us what the money gap looks like, and obviously a lot of people are just listening to this, but I'm curious to see. I mean, I know what it looks like, but people might be wondering.
So I'm in a Monograph demo account, and I can zoom in. As soon as you log in, we're 100% web-based. But I'm going to scroll right up here and just focus exactly where you see the little money sign. Today's date, which is this bar that comes down, and we're in DD phase. Oop, I clicked on it. Let's go back. And that money gap essentially is your gas gauge. And for this project, we're doing really, really well. Relative to today's date, looking at all the time logs, we're a little bit ahead, but that means I can slow down a little bit by the time we get into Monday of next week. But it's really great information to at least know in real time as I log time of where do I stand, and how much work do I need to do to either catch up or stay on pace.
Gotcha. So we're kind of like looking at two horizontal bars, one at the bottom, one above, and the bottom one is like is time, essentially, right? It's the length of the phase.
The duration of a phase. So we always know as architects, when does a phase start, and we are really good at estimating when does a phase end.
Right.
And we also know what the phase is going to cost, because we're generally speaking contractually bound to a total fee. So I know how long this phase is. I know how much this phase is worth. All that we were ever missing as industry practitioners is, well, my gas gauge. How am I doing relative to a full tank of gas? And
so ideally you'd want the time marker and the gas gauge, the money sign to align, which is never going to happen, obviously. But when the money sign is ahead, it just means you're burning a little bit more money to date.
Correct.
Gotcha.
So zoom in here. And these are all example data, so they're designed to essentially be ideally slightly better. But the goal is always to know.
Yeah.
And when I was at larger firms and even smaller firms that had a really great way of tracking our financials, the problem was that you wouldn't understand where you sat financially until the end of the month when the firm does their billings and then reconcile their billings. And then it might take another week or two before you actually have that information in front of you. So there's always a 6-week lag between where you are today and when you're going to get an update on how much hour and time and money you've spent. The problem is with architects, we can do a lot of work in 6 weeks.
Yeah, that is true. That's actually a good point as well, because a lot of times we work over hours, and so quickly the amount that we're off is 50%
Yeah.
more than maybe a typical office or something.
What's fascinating is brand new feature that we just launched not that long ago is a new invoicing report called Unbilled. And Unbilled really starts to take a look at all of your total fee.
Okay.
And relative to the time that you've logged into your timesheets, we can now calculate percentage-wise. How far along have you consumed? And then how much of that was not billed yet and how much of it is currently unbilled. Total unbilled and current unbilled since the last invoice.
Gotcha. And there's a way for firm owners to see at a glance, right, how a project is doing across multiple employees to see where everyone's gas gauge is.
I would start here first to make sure you have a full look at all your projects. You can kind of take a really quick look at all the money gas to see how everyone's doing. Immediately after that, I would tend to move over to the reports. And then I can look at the team size and know who's my most active employee in terms of who's logging the most time and who isn't. Remember, this is all dummy data, so we've designed it to be a smiley face where you can see someone who's really working really, really hard and individuals that are not working really hard. But then this doesn't really paint a full picture. The next thing you want to click on is probably team forecast. It's the same information, but now we're going to break it down to the actual work each person's doing over the course of time. And you can see here, let's say Danielle, she's working on 2 different projects and she's forecasted for X amount of hours every single week. And you can see new employees might not be allocated to projects yet. And some individuals that might start to slow down on projects as they ramp off, and then they ramp back up as they get onboarded to a new project.
So is that being automatically populated based on, I don't know, previous timesheet, or is this data populated based on tasks attributed to each person?
This data is essentially starts from the very beginning. All you have to do is plan your projects and everything else in Monograph will auto-populate.
Gotcha.
So if I go into an example project, like a fixed fee example project 1, and I click on edit, this is our planner. And we essentially go through an exercise for every project. We want to be as thoughtful as we can with all the information that you know up front, so we can essentially surface all that information to you back to you on the report side. How many individuals are working on every phase? How much do we plan for those individuals to contribute to that phase? And then they should sum up to the budget of that phase. If you add all the budgets to every phase, they should sum up to the total budget for the project.
Gotcha. And so for every project, obviously you can have multiple projects in here. You can have different staff members on each project. Each staff member is assigned a title, right? Because very often you build people differently. Principals are built higher generally than interns, usually. And then the rates per hour and the total amount of time, projected amount of time that each person is going to spend on that project and per phase.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Once we have this, we can average things out for you, which is the report you saw. But then we have what we call a resource, which allows you to plan on a weekly level. So if we click into the exact same project that we were in earlier, click on this, I know that 3 people are working on it. So I can zoom in. And you can see, well, these are the 3 people we've assigned to work on this project. This yellow dot is essentially the money gain for that individual. So we know a forecasted pace based on the total budget of where this person should be hitting. And we can essentially start to assign time this week for this person to continue to work on this project.
Gotcha. I mean, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, we're pulling the budget hours from the planner. Consume is your timesheet data. So if you plan for 567 hours, from the timer, we know that from the timesheets, we know that Anna has already logged 135 hours. Simple math, we know the remaining is 432.
Gotcha. And and the keeping track of whether you're ahead or behind on not the billing, but how much time has been burned, we're looking at is right there. I mean, I presume the green bar is how much time has passed, and the yellow dot is again how much money's been burned.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting when you're walking through this stuff because it's very easy to see how complicated things can become, even with just I don't know how large this hypothetical office is, but it's what 12 people or something and 12 projects. I don't know, something like that. And already it's a lot of things to keep track of.
It's a lot of people. Yes.
Imagine that in an Excel sheet. My goodness.
No, I know. Forget about it. Well, that's what I think also you said too. If the tool is not easily accessible and maybe even enjoyable to use, then like what are the chances you're actually going to use it in a consistent and accurate way, right?
Absolutely. This is also why design is so important. I believe design is critical for any software company or any company that's essentially designing a tool. Like you have to surface design as a number one priority, because if you don't get engagement, then you're really not, like, you can't even start solving your problem if your customer base don't engage.
Right. Specific question. So if I'm using your program and I'm at another hypothetical office, am I able to use different fee structure methods? So I do want to keep track of all my employees and what they cost per hour. But if I have a project that I don't want to bill it hourly, I want to do like a fixed fee or something like that. Is that possible?
Absolutely. So I'm going to go back to the planner. And what I'm going to show you really quick is you see schematic designs, fixed fee. And if I scroll down, CD can be fixed fee as well, but I can add a CA phase to the very bottom, and I can make sure that this phase of a project is hourly.
Nice.
With a not to exceed number.
Gotcha.
So let's say 7,000.
Gotcha.
So absolutely, even within a project, you can start to mix and match fee types from fixed fees and hourly. I think that's really, really important. And I go back to why like architects designing software for architects is really, really important, because this is such a nuance that really only our industry does this.
Yeah.
Lawyers do not do this. Doctors do not do this. Any other professional services, they generally stick to one type of fee structure throughout like the entire project.
Yeah.
Architecture, really complex, because you could be hourly at the very beginning, pre-design, when you don't really know the scope of the project yet. Once you've identified the scope, you might go into a fixed fee model. So it's one number for your SD, DD, and CD phases of a project. And then you're going to have to switch again back to hourly, because you never know how aggressive your time is going to be needed during the CA process, because you don't know until you start to break down the walls and get in there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so in the case of a fixed fee structure for a whole project or for phase, we're still able to assign dollars per hour for the different individuals and their different titles. And then the total amount of time we assume that they're going to spend. And that number is meant to equal to the total fixed fee for that phase.
Should equal to 100%.
Yeah.
If you want to ideally fully allocate your staff for that phase.
Gotcha.
That's pretty cool. I was wondering if like the money gained or anything else on the platform would be things that you would share with your client. Like you're an architect and you have a client, would it be any beneficial for them to be able to see that?
So a number of our customers do that, and we do have a feature that will allow you to share just the money gain with your clients. So if you go back and click on an edit of a project, you hit on general, we can turn on what we call project shareable link. So most of us are now familiar with like a Google Drive or Google Doc. You can think of this as a very similar approach where I can make this page shareable. I'm going to copy this link. I can open an incognito mode and paste that link and show you what a possible client might see.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
So you see the timeline. What we purposely did is remove the money gain, because generally speaking, that is your financial health of the business on the project. And most of the time, in most cases, you might not want to share that with your client. If you're making a large margin on your project, you might want to keep that to yourself. If you're bleeding a lot of money, you might want to articulate a better story and how to disclose that to your client before just showing them in the Gantt chart.
But it's kind of cool that you're duplicating the use of the financial and project management for the office with the aspect of the schedule and phases for a client. Like, you're not doing two separate spreadsheets, one for yourself and one for the client. You're just using that same tool, which is pretty great.
Double work, right? Like, that's one of the biggest problems with spreadsheet is that it's not scalable.
Yeah.
Right. Whatever you do for you and you want to disclose it for your client, you're gonna have to duplicate that Excel spreadsheet and you're gonna have to like clean it so you disclose the right information at the right time. This is where software becomes really, really powerful. Because like you shouldn't have to spend your time doing that anymore. Your time is much more valuable being an architect.
Preach. And then we're also able to have milestones within each of the phases, which is very nice. Yeah, these little stars.
Yep. Biggest advantages of this when we first launched this is to make sure that we're solving one problem along with an architect's workflow is the continual education of our clients in terms of like, well, what are the processes within an architectural design project, where we are within those phases that are very unique to architecture, and how we're progressing along, just so our clients understand where they are and where the project is, because they're not trained as architects most of the time, and they just really need to understand where is the project headed towards, and are we on schedule.
That's such a good point that we can unpack a little bit, because that is one of the biggest challenges for firm owners or for architects who work closely with clients, even if they don't own the office, is this kind of educating clients, keeping them informed and whatever. And the ability to do it easily, I think, is just really, really nice. I also like, back to the whole fixed fee versus hourly for different phases and whatnot. I think that's great because you're right. It is pretty common in architecture. You will do strange hybrid fee structures. And honestly, one thing that maybe people don't know is that every project is different a lot of times. And architects, even very established architects, like people might think, oh, well, they must have it down to a science. It's just a repeat, the same contract, the same fee structure, same everything all the time. That's very often, even for the successful designers out there, that's not the case. It's always changing. And it's a constant evolution, both to improve and sometimes just out of pure necessity, because every client and project is just different, surprisingly.
That, and to be honest, that's one of the hardest things for a software company to solve when there's not enough consistency across workflows. We carry the burden of trying to make sure that we build a tool that allows for enough flexibility, and we're also prescribing the ideal workflow. So we have to do both, which makes, well, that's part of our job every single day, and that's what makes Monograph challenging, but also exciting. It's an exciting problem to solve. But you're absolutely right. We're a service-based business. Like, most architects are going to negotiate contracts one project to another. The fee structure is going to look very different. The typologies of work we do are also very different. Like, what you might scope out for a remodel looks very different than a new ground up.
Yeah.
And that also looks very different than like a commercial space, an office space, or even like an institutional design. Like, those contracts and the way we work on them are fundamentally different.
I think one of the best ways that we figured out to kind of explain why that's the case, because this is more about client relationship conversation, but clients sometimes find this jarring. They're like, well, why can't you just give me a price today? And if you're an architect who works strictly hourly basis for everything, then yeah, it's relatively easy. It's a number and it's per hour and that's it.
Yeah.
But otherwise it gets complicated, and it's complicated because it's really hard to figure out the scope and therefore how much work it's going to take. Even if you took two houses and they're both ground up houses and they were both had very similar sites, very similar site conditions, similar kind of zonings and everything, you still don't know how long it's going to take because the client's different, right? Or even if the client's similar, then the site's different. And it's especially, as you mentioned, in remodel work, forget about it. It's impossible to know.
Well, the thing is, if you had control over everything, maybe you would have a better sense of how much time that would take. But the role of the architect and the portion of the work is just one portion out of like all the things that need to happen and work at the same time.
Yeah.
And those are things we don't have control over.
It's really hard, and I think even if you control the entire process, so think, the things that come to mind would be like a design build
Yeah.
company that like really goes from design to build all under one corporate umbrella. But even then, if you don't collect your data, it's extraordinarily hard to remember what were those trends.
Yeah.
So I think there is a future where in Monograph we can help you understand that better because we're aggregating all that information into one solution, and we can start to report back on your averages. It's not the perfect, we're never going to be exactly this is how much and how long it's going to take. But at least over time you can understand averages. You can start to group things. The goal would be like, well, if I want to look at all residential projects that span in square footages between 1,000 and 2,000 square feet over the course of like the last 5 years, what is my average? And show me from like ideally all the projects that perform great versus all the projects that perform not so well, and give me those two subsets of averages. In that scenario, we will be able to essentially inform you fairly quickly, at least a ballpark of where you should be.
And is that kind of summary data something that you're going to try and accomplish sort of down the line?
Yes.
Yeah.
How far down the line? just so we have an idea.
What's funny is that you guys started Monograph, not exactly, but roughly the same time that we started Office in a way. So we're gonna like go on this journey together.
It's gonna take a little bit of time. Everyone always asks me for a timeline. I cannot commit to a timeline, but
No, don't.
It is a lot easier relative to the other things that we have planned. So I can say that it's as long as we're collecting the right data, and the data are clean, it's going to be a lot easier for us to run the formulas, essentially give back our customers averages.
And the other point that comes up with this last bit is the kind of the thinking short term versus long term. And I think that there's different mindsets, right? When it comes to keeping track of your business and your hours and how you're doing. And it's very easy, especially for small businesses, to say, this is such a quick project or whatever excuse. Let's not bother. Let's just write down a few numbers on a piece of paper. Then you lose a piece of paper. It's like, whatever. It's a short-term thing. But the issue with that is in the long term, because it's, of course, time goes by very quickly. COVID somehow distorted time even more. So the last 3 years flew by in a week in some ways. And then suddenly you find at a point you look back and 5 years have gone by and you have no good information because you didn't establish good practices that at the time, 5 years ago, you were viewing only in the short term. And now you've lost out on 5 years of actually very, very crucial data that you could use in a very significant manner to help your business, but you don't have it.
Correct. It's a shame. It's a big shame. And I think it's important for architects because like we're really smart individuals. We can build some of the most complex structures in the world, and we're literally in charge of our entire built environment. And we do this every single day because we have the capacity to think about things in multiple scales. We're trained to do that. We can go into a project and look at that corner detail and then zoom out and do urban planning. And we can do it back and forth all day long, every single time. I think what's important for architects and myself and what Monograph continues to try to do is to make sure that the scaling version is really, really important. You have to be able to do both. So like tracking data at the short-term scenario informs the long-term, and you have to be able to think in both the bigger context and the today.
It's exciting because obviously we speak with a lot of architects who are much more established and older than us, and they have this kind of data that we're talking about. But a lot of times for them, obviously took a long time to get there, and it's always described as like we have this guy in our office and he just does Excel sheets and like that's his life, and they clearly have to spend a lot of time, working hours in the office, figuring all this out, right? Because there isn't a platform they've been using or whatever else might be, and it's beneficial for us to have these conversations because it gives us a reference, even if we don't have 20 years of office experience or having our own office.
It reminds me, I used to work in an office that I really loved back in New York, but the person in charge of taking care of the timesheets, we used to do paper timesheets, like printed, hand filled timesheets, like really old school, which I didn't mind doing. I was just thinking, how do you put like 15 employees' timesheet together every week and collect that information and somehow, like organize it and understand it? And I remember he used to have those 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper with, grids on them. Mm-hmm. He would taper them together, so it would have like a 10-foot long piece of paper with, like 5 different marker color for like each type of task or whatever. And he would spend hours and hours trying to just understand that data and put it back in a form that he could understand and look back at and make sense to him for whatever he needed those numbers for. And I've always felt so bad. I was like, oh my goodness, like there must be something else that's available. It's a torture.
If you guys ever do like a kind of, I don't know, sleazy, fun midday TV infomercial, you should do that as like the before scenario and film it in black and white. Someone taping together sheets of 8.5 by 11.
I had so much respect for him. And you know what? Also because he was able to put the timesheet out when he needed it and know exactly where to look at when he was looking for something. But oh boy,
the pain, it hurts. I need his number. I need to call him.
I can hook you up. No
problem. What was my other question here? And so obviously one of the difficult things with all of this is just the act of tracking time. And I would imagine for you, it's getting people and convincing people to be diligent and to, hey, track your time when you're doing your work. And what's interesting with you is you guys actually have like a little feature that I forget what it's called, that you can kind of like record how much time you're spending on things.
We have a little timer.
Yeah.
Which is such a small thing, but it's like amazing.
You can imagine you don't really want to just like add a whole number. Ideally, you can just hit it stopwatch and just let it run, and it can track for you in terms of like what you're working on. So yes, it's a very simple idea, but it solves a big problem.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
It's a timer that's associated. So you like select the project that you're working on, right, and the phase and whatever, and you hit go, and then you hit stop.
It's just that simple.
Yeah, that's straightforward. There is also something that's interesting with the time tracking, and you mentioned that earlier on, is that there is the actual time tracking of the hours that were spent doing something, but then there is the time maybe planning on like who and how much time should be spent on things, which I think maybe like a lot of us out there, architects, on the day-to-day thing, like we keep track of like, especially in like a teeny tiny office, right? You might just write down how much time you spend doing something, but you might not necessarily think ahead, like how much time should I be spending on something?
You need to do both.
Right.
You totally need to do both.
And
right?
that's very important.
Oh, extraordinarily. If you do not plan, which means you don't have a total, then tracking time for the sake of just tracking time isn't really worth it. It's always relative. So you always want to make sure that you track time relative to what you should be trying to hit. It's the only way to accurately give yourself a measure. If you're just saying that I've worked 10 hours, but I don't really know what the 10 hours mean, well, that's not really, really good. If you work 10 hours, but you should only work 20, well, that's really useful information. You've just consumed half of the amount of time that you should have been allocated. And now you can make actual decisions around like, well, what do I do next?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I wonder why. I feel like architects in general are not great at this and don't have a lot of interest in doing these things. These are assumptions or generalizations based on what we've seen. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's just because maybe they'd rather just think about the work, as you're kind of saying, and these other things seem not as important, or they're not fun, or.
Well, I think there's a lot of things. Well, it's a really big topic to unpack. Um, I, I think culturally as an industry, we're not motivated to track time. Like
Mm.
for a long time, it's more about the creative process. And I don't. It's really hard to cap or run through an exercise of understanding. Well, how much time should I spend on a creative process? That makes me, at least personally, very kind of uneasy.
Mm.
Of like, oh wait, I need to be creative, but yet you're trying to. I need to time cap
Hmm.
the moment that I'm in a creative process. And I think that notion has historically prohibited us to really think about how important it is and how necessary it is. And I think the conversations historically has been over index on not tracking time. And I think what I'm asking for is not that we all should track time to the every second and really restrict our ability to be creative, but I think we should allow that to essentially add constraints and scope to our own process of like, well, what are the constraints that we have to work within,
Mm.
and can we make better decisions along that creative process?
I think you're right. I think it also starts with even as early as school. When you're in undergrad, let's say, or when you're in whatever level of education, you're first learning about architecture and you're in the design studio, you don't know what you're doing. So this idea of tracking time to complete a project, it's like, well, I've never even completed a project yet. So
It's
I have to
going
just,
against you.
I just have to see what happens. And I get that. That's why like all-nighters, they do happen sometimes when you're a student.
If you're not organized.
Well, but
Not all of us did all-nighters. Thank
sure,
you.
fine. But some of us are just harder workers. That's all. but
Oh, a little bit lost.
but at some point, you do have, even at the level of a student on a student project, you have enough data, even if it's just intuitive data. By the time you get to fifth year, you're like, okay, if someone assigns me this miniature project and I've done something like that before, I have a sense of keeping pace.
Mm-hmm.
I know if I've had 4 weeks to do it, if at week 1 I haven't gotten to doing X deliverable or working on that, I know I'm going to be screwed. And you know that because you've gone through it a couple of times by that point. And I think the same thing maybe applies, but so some of that, but in school, no one tracks their time. It's all intuitive. And I think the transition from that to the profession is one where you do have to actually keep track of your time as best as possible. And so I think what I'm saying is I think in school, some of that, just work creatively and be free, and whatever it takes is what I'm going to do, and it just until the night before, and then the deadline hits, and then it's over with. That's the amount of tracking time is when is the deadline, when is the pinup, and that's it. And I think some of that mentality sometimes bleeds over.
Well, I think it's the hardest leap for any young designer, because I think, and it's not to the fault of anyone, right? Like I think the environments you're in are fundamentally different, and making that leap is always going to be hard. I don't think technology is ever going to fully solve the leap between your time in academia and your time as a practitioner, because the constraints are very different, right? Like the constraints when you're in school is only time, right? Like it's not, you're not contracted by a client, so you don't have a monetary constraint, which is why every architect, I'm generalizing here as well, pulls all-nighters and works all the way up to like the minute before pinup, because your only constraint is time, and we're gonna use up every single minute we can to pull off the best darn project ever. But that's while you're in academia. By the time you graduate and you're making the transition to practice, you have an added constraint. The time factor didn't go away, so you still have deadlines, you have deliverables, but now you have to hit those timelines and deliverables within a financial constraint, because at practice it's a business.
Oh, that's a fan. I already know that's going to be a clip we're going to make.
but yeah, that's a
That's
good one. That's a good one. But I think that you guys are right, and maybe it's just a matter of switching the mindset with and our relationship to time, right? I feel like maybe we feel in school and after school as time is our enemy, right? It's the bad guy we don't want to have to think about or deal with, right? But if you switch it around and you think about time as being your ally and knowing it well and manage it well and, pay attention to it would be helpful. So
it's like
maybe it's just changing the mindset.
It's like something you can't fear.
Yeah, I mean, you can fear and deny it, but at some point, it's just going to catch up with you, and you're going to have to deal with it, right? So,
it's a necessity in the world, right? We all at some point have to face. We live in a world where we have to talk about money. So get comfortable with money. The sooner you are, the better off you might be. And we all know that we don't have an infinite amount of time, so we want to get to a point where we manage our time effectively. If I think back to my studio days, some of my best presentations are when I had a full night of sleep.
Yeah.
And some of my worst presentations are when I pull an all-nighter. So there is a correlation between like managing my time so I can have a good night's sleep. So I have a really fruitful conversation and critique the next day and not be, extraordinarily tired because I just did an all-nighter. It was one thing I used to do a lot when I did have time before a critic was I will look up who my critics are. So like I know like their background, I know what they specialized in, I know what interests them, and I can start to essentially formulate a presentation that I know that's going to have a much more likelihood of being perceived well, because I already know who my audience is.
Yeah, that's incredibly smart.
A lot harder when you're like giving a presentation and like, I don't know my critics, and I don't know what position they have relative to the work that I'm about to deliver.
Yeah, no, for sure. And if you've had no sleep,
that's definitely not a good combo.
No,
but it in a strange way, as exactly as you said, it's different once you graduate because you have this financial layer that gets put on top of this constraint, if you want to call it a constraint. And there's many other constraints that exist in the professional setting that don't exist in school. But nonetheless, essentially what we're kind of talking about is how you allocate resources and being mindful that you do have resources, and the resources should be perceived as being finite, and you want to be as efficient and sustainable as you can with it. And I think that's something that too, we know plenty of successful architects, and we know plenty of architects who are, let's say, not successful. They're surviving, but they're not happy with where they ended up and whatever. And it is a cumulative thing. It took many years for them to get to that point. And it's almost like, we talk about best practices, and then there are, bad practices, I guess. They employ these bad practices that seem like fairly minor aggressions or minor things. But over the course, as I was saying before, over the course of 5 years, we have no data, but over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, well, now, just in terms of how you've evolved as a human being and grown, like you're this old person who hasn't made enough money to support them or their kid or whatever it might be. And it's a tough place to get out of. And I think that's, I don't know where I'm going exactly, but that's also, I think, where the whole being a student part of this conversation is interesting, because I think the more that future firm owners think about these things now, the better. And I do feel like the younger generation is more in tune with these topics than maybe the older generation.
Well, practice is constantly changing, right? And I think the next generation of designers and architects fundamentally look at the data, understanding data, and utilizing information fundamentally different than the previous generation. And I think that's going to be extraordinarily empowering for the next wave of firms and practices, because they're not scared. They're not scared to look at data, and they're not scared to look at information to essentially help them drive better decisions, and also help them understand where to focus. Sometimes, like, as we all know, running a practice is really hard. There's a lot of moving pieces. There's obviously the design and creative end, but there's the management side, there's the hiring side, there's acquiring new clienteles, there's executing and maintaining existing clientele, there's taxes, there's a lot of moving pieces. And sometimes the hardest thing to do is really just to know, where do I focus my time? And it's really difficult to know that if you don't have some type of supporting information to drive you towards like, this is where I focus, because like the numbers tell me that this is where I should focus.
What's also interesting is that because of what you do, you guys are kind of in contact with a lot of different architecture offices and similar businesses, and the conversations you have with them are around the subject of practice and how you keep track of time and how you be financially successful and stable and all of these things. And you had mentioned just now that, you know, practices are going, the practices in general are going to evolve and change. I'm curious to know, like, what are some of the things you've seen that people are bringing up in terms of how they run a practice that might be different from before, whenever that was, or it might be different projected in the future, in addition to this kind of, like you're mentioning, openness to using data and being more reliant on data?
You know, what's really impactful, and I had hunches when we started Monograph, and we didn't really validate until recently when we were looking at our own data, that most firms start with Monograph tracking time, generally speaking, once a week, which is probably the industry norm to log your hours on a Friday late afternoon
Right.
for the entire week. What we've noticed though with some of our oldest customers is that over time, the entire organization starts to track time daily, which is insane. And that makes a ton of sense because like our entire application is in real time. Everything moves as soon as you log an entry. So why wait until the end of the week? Like, you're going to know in real time today, if you log your time today, and you can make better decisions literally tomorrow because you've logged time today. So a large subset of our customer base now logs time daily.
That's pretty cool.
What's fascinating, one more thing that we've discovered is like being more transparent with how a project is going has actually started to make sure that the rest of the team, especially if you have a larger team, to make better decisions. You know, if you're working late on a Tuesday evening and you're debating if you should do one more iteration, and you look at the money gain and it's ahead, you might not. And you don't need a principal or design lead to tell you that, which essentially starts to drive a really new wave of energy within our customer base, where being more transparent around where the project is actually helping the entire team make better decisions, not just at the leadership level, but all the way down to the individual contributors and to the lower level designers.
I think that's a trend too that we're starting to see a little bit, even just outside the project team, but even like across the profession, right? I mean, you guys have like talks and section cuts, and you have like those types of discussions with people who are practicing architecture as much as we do on the podcast. And I think talking about best and bad practices is probably the best way to make sure that we're all moving forward together, and the transparency of things, and not withholding information. Like, at the end of the day, we're all doing the same thing. We're all trying to be successful. So why not just talk about those things more openly, right?
It was really funny. It reminds me of a story when I was still a project manager, and I got in trouble because the project fell behind schedule. And we've utilized too much time and too much money. And while I was receiving this, I asked a very simple question. I was like, I can't hold to a budget if you don't tell me that what the budget is.
That's fair.
Touché.
Like I don't intentionally, as a, you know, I think of myself as a decent human being. Like I don't want to go over budget. Like I didn't join the practice intentionally to hurt the project. I want to make sure that we deliver great architecture and obviously not lose money on it. It's just really hard for me to hold to a budget if I don't know the budget. So, you know, it just continues to validate a lot of the early decisions on why we started Monograph. Was like, it's just not a really sustainable way of working. Yeah. Like we should, you know, it's a big task that I've given myself, my co-founders, and the team that we've hired, but we're focused on trying to really move the industry forward, and that's going to be a really difficult task. But we have great help, and it's gonna be tough, but we can do it.
Yeah, and I think I have more and more optimism, especially when we have conversations with the younger generation, because I think that they seem to be just much more in tune with these things, and it is remarkable, actually. When you were talking about the specific, so Marina, you were talking about like profession-wide kind of transparency, and Robert, you were talking about within an office. Within the scope of being within an office is also interesting because it's kind of, I don't know. To me, it's really remarkable because if you imagine that everyone in the office has that level of knowledge of where a project is and how it's doing financially, on like the most open extreme sense. If you compare that to a practice where there's a lot of hierarchy and no one knows anything about the budget except for the top people, those are completely different offices in a lot of ways. Like, it's hard to overemphasize how different that would be.
What they are, and also sometimes the upper management who knows the budget doesn't actually know how much time it takes to do those tasks.
Yeah.
So how are you expecting good, management?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't have an answer other than yes, I agree that within firm typologies, the cultures are they can vary greatly. Yeah. Right, like and how one operates versus another. I'm not saying that there's a wrong way or a right way. I do have fun belief in terms of like what I believe is a more appropriate way, but it's very different. And the operational workflows are very different. And it's hard to drive excellence if you're very top heavy and you gate all the information. I'm not saying that's impossible. It just means the leaders of those organizations need to be so much more effective.
Yeah.
Right. Like they need to be so much more effective to make sure that they're executing at a very high level, where on the other approach, you get a lot of support. That essentially supports leadership, and it truly is all for one, and everyone's in it to ensure that the best outcome for the practice. And it's just a very different way of perceiving work culture and practice operations. We could probably spend another entire episode on just culture itself and why culture is so important when building a practice, and how do you design culture. How do you assess culture, and how do you like motivate culture as it evolves over time? Yeah,
I love that you kind of encapsulated what I was blabbering on about with the word culture, because that's what I was trying to get at, but I wasn't able to say it. It's a very different thing, and the support that you said, it makes total sense. You have to support when everyone's kind of on the same page. The feeling of being in the office would be different. The data would be different because you could potentially be getting feedback from everybody at all the levels, saying like, "Hey, I noticed this, or I had this idea, or we're seeing these patterns. Have you seen this?" And you were talking about when there is a very thick division between the upper tier people in the office, the principals and whatnot, who have all the information for those between them and those who don't. Yeah, it is a lot of pressure for them to do, and frankly, from what we've kind of seen, just because there is that level of the division does not mean that the people at the top are doing a good job. Sometimes that veil exists to hide that they don't want anyone else to know what's going on, in part because it's kind of a mess.
And it's okay, right? Like every small business at some degree is a mess. All right, it's about like how much do we want to disclose the mess to the public, and how much are we going to be thoughtful about like saying we need a little help in cleaning up that mess. Some of this mess is totally repairable, and like to do it all by yourself, it's extraordinarily hard, right? Like this is probably one of the leading causes to like a lot of burnouts with architects, is because like the burden that they've put on themselves because of the culture that they've developed is extraordinarily high. And it doesn't have to be. It really doesn't.
Yeah. Earlier in the conversation, when we were talking about, I think at that point it was discussing the transition from school to the profession, and this desire to just be focused on the creativity and the creative process and focus on that and the outcome and the deadline, and that's it, and not worry about the financials, not worry about how many hours are being spent and whatnot. I think it in the larger sense is that funnels from the fact that architecture itself is has always been in a weird position of being, right, what they say, it's part art and part science. It's part art, but it's also a business. It's a service, but it's a product. It's like this weird split between these multiple different two sides of worlds. And I think it all trickles down from that. And it's interesting to have a product and a business, like Monograph, which is essentially trying to like stitch together those two sides and say, hey, we all know we have to be good at both sides, but let's see if we can make it easier to do that and more effective.
Exactly, right? Like ideally supplying the industry with more tools to navigate both the creative side and the business side. And historically, there's been a lot of tools that are designed and are out there that supports the creative side. Like we can think of 3D modeling tools that exist today. There's a whole bunch of energy efficiency modeling tools. There's a lot of like creative tools that help us generate complex geometries that are extraordinarily powerful, that really supports a lot of our creative side of the process. What's been lacking for many decades is there's not enough tools to really support the business side. And I think that's what makes Monograph really unique, and it motivates me because it's like, oh, like we're adding another piece to the larger puzzle that's been missing for a very long time.
Are there, and maybe you can't disclose them, are there other ideas or things that other tools or aspects of the tool that you guys kind of envision? I like the way you're describing it a lot, because at least for me, it's very clear. You have the creative tools, you have your toolbox, you have your Revit, your SketchUp, your Photoshop, you have all of that stuff. You have your laser cutting equipment, your 3D printing, whatever. And then you kind of visually think, okay, on one side I have all these things, and you look at the other side of the line, the business, it's like it's just a blank page.
It's Excel spreadsheets.
Yeah, Excel spreadsheets. And then Monograph, and time tracking. Are there other things that you're brainstorming that would be on the business side that would be helpful?
So, a fascinating question. Yes. At the end of the day, I think they're going to be a suite of tools that solve a whole bunch of practice operational workflows. We're just solving a really small piece of that by going from tracking time, managing your time, invoicing for your time, and getting paid for your time. The other aspects that we'll love to start solving, and probably not anytime soon yet, but we start with time. How does an employee get paid? Where does their expenses go? Can we make that process a lot easier in terms of like solving a payroll problem? Is we still start with time. We're just going in a different direction at that point. But that will be a fascinating topic for us, for Monograph, to really like take on too, because like we really want to solve a lot of your back of house problems. So like outside of just tracking your projects, billing for your projects, collecting your money for your project. How do you get paid literally if you have employees and staff on running payroll? And there's other aspects to the financial side of a business that we'd love to start tackling. Do most architects have working capital? How do architects get working capital? Is working capital enough? These are fascinating conversations for me, and I think really strong, viable future products for Monograph to also tackle in the future.
Yeah, that would be pretty awesome if you could have a program that has all of your business finances in one spot, so you can really understand like what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine how much work that would take.
I need more time, and I need to continue to hold conversations with our investors to continue to fund this vision of ours. And I think when we do execute on this vision, it's going to be a phenomenally different world that we're helping architects navigate. Yeah. Imagine all the softwares that you just listed on the design side, and that right now there might just be one, let's say Monograph, but we only really solve time sheets through invoicing and payments. imagine we start to fill in that side of the equation and we solve other aspects of practice operations. If you think of it that way, that's kind of like my longer vision for what are the products that we were going to start to tackle, and how many different sets of problems we want to solve back of house.
It's interesting. And I guess also, and maybe this sounds obvious, but with the way, you're describing the vision in this broader scope, that, Monograph could almost only have been created kind of at this point in time, and the evolution of technology and the internet and all of these things, and the kind of the automation is a word to some degree of some of these things. If automation in particular, if we think about the person with the 8.5x11s that Marina described, where they staple them or tape them to make a 10-foot long thing, automating that, which is ridiculous, to something where you punch it in on your browser, which everyone has a browser, and then it does it for you, and it spits out of data in a bunch of different ways. And I don't know, that kind of having a more automated approach and a smart approach to things, I could see where like this is the moment for it to take place.
100% agree. You just asked like a very classic investor question. It's like, why now? Right? Like Autodesk has been around for a very long time. SketchUp has been around for a long time. Even Revit's actually been around for a very long time. Could Monograph have existed a decade ago, 2 decades ago? My argument typically is no. Like the industry and the market wasn't ready. Really, really wasn't ready. There has to be a convergence of a younger generation that really understands the tool, and the fundamental infrastructure of how software is developed has to also change, which we're finally in. Coupled with an unforeseen pandemic, really started to make this the right time for Monograph to emerge. I can't give myself credit, so I just got really, really lucky that this is the right time to really start solving this problem. So I was in the right place at the right time.
It is remarkable because we were at a tech meetup recently. It was a meetup, but it was basically tech, and we were there for various reasons, and it was interesting to hear. And of course, this was in San Francisco, so like this is like kind of tech central, so maybe our perspective is a bit skewed. But the amount of like AI and scripts and programs that are being created for, I don't know, 100,000 different things and they're problem solving, to problem solve some aspect of a process of a business or whatever that has been that is currently being done in an antiquated, long form, manual way is insane. It's insane how many of these applications and programs and people in this space are doing it, and and so I guess Monograph is basically you're in that space, but it just happens to be that you're helping out architects as opposed to other engineers.
I love the city for a lot of those reasons. Part of me is always reminding myself that I want to be a lifelong student. And being in San Francisco kind of reminds me of just being in studio the whole time. Obviously, the medium work is very different, but everyone is extraordinarily innovative. We're all trying to do our best to solve problems that are extraordinarily meaningful to society. We're all tackling problems in different industries. Monograph is tackling a very specific problem within architecture and engineering. But there's people that I meet that are attacking like the food shortage problem, a water problem, a farming problem, a pollution problem. And these are like, and transportation problems. Like these are problems we're gonna have to face over time. And there's nowhere better in the world other than San Francisco where there's a large concentration of people solving really fascinating problems. Studio life.
Yeah, there is definitely that energy, though. That's totally correct.
Yeah.
When you meet these people and they're not. Sometimes they're student age, and I'm like, get out of here! You're too young to be talking to me about. No, but a lot of times they're older and they have that energy and that like excitement and that edge to them that I think like students have a lot of times, and it's fun to be around them because it's just. It also makes my heart palpitate. It's like, man, I'm very nervous for you because a lot of those folks, they're on the edge, right? It's either like a make or break moment. They're looking for investments or investors, but it's nonetheless invigorating, you know.
Oh, it's super exciting. And even if you don't receive the investment, as a young individual, you probably would have walked away learning a lot, a lot more than not trying at all.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to ask you about section cut a little bit, and maybe you could just tell people what section cut is, because I think it's great you guys are doing it. But like, what is section cut, and what is, you guys have a podcast? Like, what are these other things that the company is doing?
Oh, well, we do a lot. So let's start with section cut. Section cut is a conference. It's a monograph conference dedicated to really like giving a voice for practice operations and practice operators to share insights and share stories, good and bad, in terms of like the current state of practice operations. It's a virtual conference that we 100% sponsor, and we want to make sure that we give a platform and the stage for other practitioners to really voice and share their knowledge to the rest of the industry. It's extraordinarily meaningful and really, really something that I hold extraordinarily close to my heart, because Section Cut is a name and a website domain name that I've owned since graduating from graduate school.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
it's taken many lives, prior to Monograph, and I am so happy that we can fold it back into the family, and really give it new purpose.
And it's totally sponsored by you guys, and you also it's not how do I say this? Sometimes folks hear of an architecture conference and they're like, okay, who do they have at this conference? Some bunch of architects, I don't know their names, I've never heard of them. First of all, there's a lot of architects who do brilliant work that people just don't know about. But you guys also have some pretty heavy hitters. The last I saw, like, really. And I was wondering, like, what are some of the kind of key takeaways that you guys have learned from those conferences, or like larger kind of patterns between the practices?
At the end of the day, even though there might be fundamentally an operational divide between large firms and small firms in terms of how they operate, what's fascinating is like our objectives are all the same. There's a problem here and we really want to move the needle together. I think there's a lot that small firms can learn from large firms, and there's a lot that large firms can learn from small firms. And that's a fantastic learning that we continue to see every single time we do a section cut conference.
And you feel like it's important for you guys to encourage those types of conversation in general, right? I mean,
absolutely. Remember, like our end goal is really to move the industry forward. We have the means and the capacity to set the stage, and so we should. What's fascinating for Monograph, in a very selfish way, is that we learn a lot too, in terms of like trying to set direction where the product needs to go, and what are the larger thematic problems we should try to continue to focus. And it's a great way for us to aggregate a whole bunch of industry leaders and really understand, like, are we going to be correct in terms of like what is the next thing we need to solve and how do we solve it?
That's a good point. Yeah, that's great. I mean, you're you're helping the profession, you're helping you guys, because I mean, otherwise you would have that very typical and classic problem of when you're producing a product, you don't know who the users are until perhaps you do a bunch of research or you put it out there and you see what the feedback is. But in this case, you're able to kind of do the research in advance in a certain sense.
Well, we want to be a company that's extraordinarily customer centric, and we want to be very thoughtful that we know that some problems that persist today, if we solve them, might not be problems tomorrow, which is great, but other problems will surface, and we need to stay ahead of that. And we want to make sure that we really, really listen to our customers and make sure that we are always prioritizing what is the most important to work on. Regardless of how big Monograph eventually becomes, regardless of how much money we raise, being thoughtful and focused is really difficult. And we need to make sure that we are thoughtful and focused all the time.
So what is the plan for, like, from a year from now? Like, are you guys planning to grow twice as much? Are you just trying to ply through like that to-do list that you have with the same crew? What's forward for you guys?
I think through the next year, we're going to try to hold fairly steady and really start to take a big chunk of the work that we have to accomplish and try to take off a big chunk of it. We're going to continue to grow. Are we going to grow at the same velocity? Is yet to be known. So like we really need to understand where the pull of the market is and really kind of like grow healthy relative to like how the business is doing and where the market's pulling us.
Earlier you were saying that, this is going back in the conversation, that you were able to see that some of your longtime users have shifted from tracking hours less frequently, or let's say on a weekly basis, to more frequently, to even on a daily basis. What other kind of like stats or information are you guys able to get from your perspective of being the people who produce and distribute and all that other stuff with Monograph? Because you're kind of actually in a very unique position to have a lot of conversations through Section Cut, but also to see how practices are operating in across a larger field than most architects, obviously, who are just so focused on trying to get through the week, the month, the year, that they just look at their own practice and maybe have a few conversations at best with a few others or listen to a podcast here or there. But you guys really have like a broader view of it all.
We do, and we're still a young company, so we're still trying to make sure that we understand all the data that we collect in a much more intelligent way. To share another fantastic trend that we've been seeing is like once you become a Monograph customer, the likelihood that you're going to add on another employee or multiple employees grows substantially. So your efficiency level becomes a lot better, and the net result of that is that your company grows. And we see that because like our entire customer base has been growing with the same subset of companies. So like that means all of the companies that have signed on with Monograph, generally speaking, over time grows, which is really fantastic news to my ears to understand that we are absolutely helping the industry grow, and the businesses are growing, which means they're hiring, which means they're creating jobs for the broader market.
Have you noticed any consumers who are kind of like bad students with Monograph? Like they don't log on time, they don't keep track of stuff despite using the software. And if that's the case, do you think maybe having some like little alerts or emojis popping at them just to try and like wake them up and put them back on track could help?
I'll say it again, we're still a really young company, and I think we can. Even though I believe we solve a lot of problems really well, there's always room for improvement, always. So I would love to send some emojis your way.
Please
That'd
do.
be an awesome feature if an emoji would just pop up every now and then. Hey, you're not tracking your time.
Hey, what are you doing, Marina? It's Monday. Come on.
I tell my team all the time, we have to stay really, really focused on solving really impactful problems first. But at some point, we will be solving emoji problems and making sure that you log your time.
Is it hard to kind of contain the excitement of working on a bunch of new things and exploring new territories within Monograph when you still feel like you're not quite ready yet? Like it's like in design that happens all the time on projects where you get excited about a space, material, a window, and you kind of like see already how you want it to be, but you have like the rest of the house to design first, right?
So I think this is a classic problem for any professional. And to answer your question, yeah, like it's always going to be hard to make sure that we stay focused and we don't get distracted by the next shiny object. And there will always be a time and place to work on it. We just need to be extraordinarily thoughtful that we're spending our time as Monograph software engineers, Monograph product designers, Monograph sales reps, customer success reps, marketing leaders, that we're really spending our time wisely. If not, at the end of the day, in aggregate, we're not moving the needle to push the industry forward.
Mm-hmm. Do you guys actually use Monograph at Monograph?
It's a slightly different industry, but yeah. Who's the Monograph of Monograph?
We don't. Mostly because like we're so many different teams and departments.
Yeah.
So like in aggregate, each department have their own version of what a monograph does, to make sure that and there's a huge emphasis from me to the whole team that we need to have the best tools possible, so we can also measure our own performance and how we work as a software and technology company. And those have to be very unique because each team is very unique and they operate very differently. If anything, this is probably one of the biggest challenges for me as a young CEO, to make sure that like it's not like an architectural office. An architectural office, generally speaking, everyone's an architect, and everyone's working on projects. In a software company, well, we have a marketing team, we have an ops team, we have a sales team, a customer service team, a support team, a product team, and engineering team.
Wow.
There's a lot of teams, and they deliver value in very different ways. So the tools they need are also very, very different.
And this is just talking about Monograph now, but I'm curious, and I think listeners will be too. So with all these different people that you mentioned, are they all like hired full time at Monograph, or are they sometimes brought on just for specific tasks as like consultants, or I guess freelancers would be another term?
So the 50% number that I gave you earlier, that's full-time employees.
Wow.
Yeah, and we do also subcontract out and have freelancers, and they vary depending on department. But if you count those, and my math is a little fuzzy, but we're probably north of 60. I generally don't count them because they're not on our payroll, and they're freelancers.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Is everyone like local in San Francisco, or is everyone dispersed and remote?
We're fully remote. We're 100% distributed. We're a remote first organization. So we have employees everywhere and internationally. My chief of staff, he's in Canada. We have engineers in Finland, and we have an engineer in Spain, in Madrid. And everyone travels. I think our head of design, head of product right now is in Bali. So we encourage everyone to be remote. And we really emphasize on trying to make sure we build a culture here which fosters remote first, but not remote only.
So I can't remember when Monograph had started, but COVID happened in the long view of things fairly early on in a way, with Monograph. Like, what are some of the challenges, I guess, or what has it been like to be the CEO of a company like Monograph through COVID and have it be fully remote? Like, is it difficult to establish an office culture? Is it difficult to have that kind of relationship with the various people?
Oh my God! If anyone tells you it's easy, they're lying. Of course, it's difficult, right? Like you lose a lot of the interpersonal relationships, and you lose a lot of the interpersonal interactions. So it's really hard, not impossible, because I believe we have an incredible culture here, and we've been able to pull it off. But I'd be totally lying if I told you that was also easy. It takes a lot of work, and we have to continue to embody one of our very first values, which is just being people first. And that helps make sure that we set the right stage and the right, let's say, bar for the type of working environment we want to create here at Monograph. But it is not easy.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, I feel like COVID has probably made a lot of us a bit more, I hope, organized and efficient, right? And maybe aware of creating connection or being social, or work hours versus personal time, and those types of things, where maybe before we just didn't even pay as much attention to it. Probably.
I think it shined a light on a lot of things that we didn't have to before, right? In terms of just basic communication skills, you can imagine if you're in an office environment, I know how you're feeling just by looking at you.
Yeah.
We're on a Zoom call right now. Like it's hard, and I've been talking to you for over an hour and a half, and I have not seen your faces. It's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to like have a conversation and really get to know someone digitally when all you see is a Zoom window. But that does surface like, well, that means we have to communicate a lot better verbally. We have to communicate a lot better written. We have to be a lot more organized and thoughtful in where we track conversations, because we don't see the entire body and we're not in the same room. So it definitely shines a light in terms of other aspects of communications we have to work on. But it's not impossible. It just means we have to focus the work there.
Yeah. I think another question I had, which people might as well, is we assume that a lot of listeners are architects, they know what all the architects and offices do on a day-to-day. Everyone's doing different tasks. In some ways, when we hear that, Monograph is 50 person, 60 people with the freelancers or consultants, like, what are all those people doing? I mean, it sounds like a really dumb question, but I mean, honestly, I do have that question for you and for other tech companies. I'm sure, for sure that's the case, but it's like, what is happening that keeps you so busy to have 50 people?
Oh my God. And one, you should never perceive that you're ever asking stupid questions. I don't believe there's ever a such thing as a stupid question. You can ask.
I don't know. From David, there's quite a
few. Like the fact that you are asking questions means that it's not stupid, right? Because it informs me that you want to know, and you are uninformed, and you have a high degree of curiosity. That's not stupid.
Wow, thank you.
That's really that's excitement. So generally speaking, half the company are product engineers, and the other half the company are ops, marketing, sales, and success. And on the product side, you can see how complicated it is in terms of how many spreadsheets we're trying to remove. And it takes a lot of engineers to essentially build that product. It's highly complex, and there's a lot of moving pieces, especially if we don't want to be clunky and we want to be extraordinarily streamlined. If we start thinking in modules, then we might need less engineers, but I don't want to build a 1980s version of Monograph. I want to build the next generation of Monograph. And to do that, information needs to flow seamlessly. And we need to stop thinking in modules, and things are all interconnected. When you think of it that way, it's really, really hard for a software engineer.
What is the module?
So a module would be like if we just did timesheet, but it didn't inform any of the reports.
I see.
And you need to essentially, and you see this in a lot of like older legacy software where like it's just that information is just contained there. It doesn't actually speak to other aspects of the same software, which is a classic problem when you start to think about softwares historically in modules where everything's kind of like segmented and contained. When you start to think of like information as more free-flowing and interconnected, once you track something in one area of the app, it just feeds and permeates everywhere else. That is a much more interconnected way of like solving a software problem, but also much, much more difficult from an engineering perspective and very difficult from a product design perspective.
I see. So it's sort of like, in architects' terms, CAD versus BIM.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Like when things start to like are interconnected, and they're like, if you make one little tweak here, it actually impacts 1,000 other places. Well, that's really hard. Versus AutoCAD back in the day, well, you can make one tweak here, but it doesn't impact anything else. That's a much simpler version of a software application.
Gotcha.
And I do not think it's the right displacement of time if we're just going to build old software. We should be really trying to find solutions in how data can be intertwined and interconnected.
Do you guys find yourself looking at other softwares and programs to try to think outside of the box of the typical spreadsheet functions?
All the time. I think as architects, we do this all the time with like case studies, and we look at like other architectural projects for inspiration. I see it no differently from a software development and product development perspective. If we work only in isolation, our ideas are only as good as we perceive them to be. We need to constantly be educating ourselves from an engineering and product perspective as well, and understand that there's also others really, really smart engineers and product designers out there that are not part of the Monograph family.
And so what happens when you have a current iteration of Monograph? It's out, it's published, everyone's using it, right? Essentially are the 50%, the engineers, I think you mentioned, they're basically working on like the next one, or is it bug fixes?
All the above. I think it'll be I'll be lying if I said that we build code and we ship product completely bug free. There will always be things that are short-sighted that we did not catch right from the get-go, and we have to fix it. And there's always going to be versions 2, 3, 4, 5, up until infinity on everything we build, because we know everything we do can be done better. So that engineering team is doing a lot. They not only have to fix things that are, let's say, called a bug, they not only have to be thinking about what a version 2 of that feature is, but they also have to be thinking about, well, what's the next brand new feature that we want to introduce to the product line. So they're tackling quite a lot all at the same time.
Besides, so there is, like you said, like fixing issues, adding features, and then there is like new versions of the whole program eventually.
So we keep things simple, new versions of essentially the same feature.
Gotcha.
Right. So think of this, like I think you've been using Monograph for a while. We had at least 2 versions of invoicing while your tenure was here. And that's because we saw the first version was doing fairly well, but there's obviously room for improvement, and the workflow can be a lot better. So we spent a lot of time designing a brand new workflow. Then we spent a lot of time building a new invoicing application that plugs into Monograph to solve for that. I still think that there's another version after this, so we're going to continue to improve that workflow. And I think we have to keep this mindset, because if not, we're going to eventually also be old and clunky.
Yeah.
I do not want to be old and clunky.
Oh, really?
So no, like the only way to avoid that future from happening is that we keep a really young mind, and we continue to invest in R&D, and we iterate on everything.
It's interesting, and obviously the other 50% of the people you mentioned, they're you listed a bunch of different kind of roles. There's marketing,
sales, and customer support.
Gotcha.
So Section Cut is a big conference. I cannot do it by myself, guys.
It's big.
Yeah, and it's funny because I feel like with things like that also, there's maybe a perception sometimes of like, well, what's to do? You kind of send invites, you make a flyer, an email thing, and then you host it on whatever platform and you hit go. But having been involved with a few, it's an incredible amount of, even if it's just virtual, it's like so much work.
You know, for those of us that are a little bit older and have gone through a wedding, it's coordination at that level. Like there's just a lot of coordination and make sure everyone's in the right place at the right time, and we have all of our T's and dots all checked. It takes an entire team to really, really pull it off. It's not as simple as like just send a couple of emails and let's do it. I wish it was, but it definitely isn't. And marketing has a really, really hard job of like making sure that they are at the front lines of essentially like sharing our vision and mission and executing on our conferences, on our Thursday webinars consistently at a very high bar. They're doing a phenomenal work, but it does take a whole team to pull it off.
Would you eventually someday do it in person?
It's been top of my mind. I think we're many years away from actually pulling off a physical event. I think there's a lot of advantages for having it virtual that are hard to displace.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, especially if you have a bunch of different people, it's easier for not just for you guys, but also for the people who are participating as the speakers or the keynotes folks or the viewers. Everyone logs in, you can do it, and it's easier.
I'm just looking for excuses to travel places and have fun and meet people.
What? We should meet up at the AIA events. Like they do a lot of in-persons, and we can meet there.
Yeah.
Boom. See, problem solved.
Okay, fine. Let me know when, what time.
I think it's interesting. We're almost out of the time, actually. But I think it's interesting that a lot of companies have a dedicated like marketing team and all these other folks that you're mentioning, but it's historically has not been that commonplace for architecture offices to have those same people. And I think it's becoming more common because we're realizing now that more and more offices who you wouldn't know this, I don't know how a person would know it, that they actually have a dedicated PR person either in-house or a third-party company, and they have a marketing person. Like, this is part of the game now. You know, and I think people are understanding that as if you want to be successful, unless you're the 0.01% who somehow achieved that level of success and you're everywhere already, aside from that, you need to allocate time and resources and have even faculty dedicated to these things.
So what's fascinating is like when an organization's commit to Monograph, their entire team comes on board. So we do get insights into what teams are expanding and where they're expanding. And are they essentially billable employees? So these would be like your architectural designers classically, or non-billable employees, which would be your marketing team, your biz ops team, your accounting team, your HR team. And these we do see a lot more firms growing that way, and I highly support it. Because I think at the end of the day, if you want to execute at a very high level, you need to dedicate someone full time. It's really, really hard for one person to manage, let's say, 4 or 5 projects and run your website and run your business development, and be active on Instagram. Like it's really hard for one person to do that. And if you really want to invest, you have to invest someone dedicated.
We need the experts.
The experts?
Yeah.
Well, it's also, there's been this mentality, and it's partially true, and it's partly the strength of, I think, the architectural education and architects in general, is that the ability to do a bunch of different things, right? And part of that training happens when you're in school, but at some point when you get to whatever professional level and size of office, you do realize, well, no, I can't be spending my time or having these architects who think that they're experts in everything do everything. It doesn't make sense at some level.
Yeah.
No, and you're not the expendable, right? Like you cannot stretch in all the direction you have to to be optimum at all the tasks you think you could do. It's not achievable.
Right.
I was speaking to a friend of mine, and I can't remember exactly, but the quote was somewhere around like, we all know that if you're extraordinarily smart and capable, you can do a lot of things. You can actually occupy many, many hats. The real question is not if you can, because we all know that you can. The real question is, should you be? And that answer should change over time, right? Like if you're just starting off and you're a firm size of 1, well, yeah, you're wearing all the hats. But if the company is growing and you're a team size of 5+, 10+, 20+, the real question now is like, should you be? And you have to be very, very thoughtful. And like, should you as an individual firm leader be doing too many things? Because you might not be doing any of them well anymore at that scale.
Yeah. Growing pains and opportunities. We should probably have another recording where we just talk about that with you.
I think this session, we probably have like at least 4, 5, 6 different topics we can spend another 2 hours on.
It works. As always, Robert, thank you for being on the show. This was awesome, as expected. And thank you so much for being here. And of course, thank you so much for what you guys are doing with the specific place that you're at now with Monograph, and also the future and the larger vision. That's all of that makes it very exciting for us, and I think a lot of people.
Thank you so much for inviting me and having me back again. I really appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this video on YouTube. If you like what we're doing, then please support our show by hitting that subscribe button and liking and commenting on our videos.
You can also find us on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're mostly on Instagram. And you can reach out to the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message or leave a voicemail if you have any reaction to this recording, any questions you might have, or guest suggestion. Feel free to send it our way.
Cool. Thank you for watching, and see you next week.
Thanks. Bye-bye.